you would rather be in a society where 20% of people wear hijab, but the percentage of practice is going up 3% a year, than in a society where 60% or 70% of people wear hijab, but the number of people practicing it is going down 3% a year. If you're on God's team, not God is on my team, because it's not my team. If I'm on God's team is going to win. I might die. And that's okay.
Bismillah. What's going on, guys? Welcome to episode unnumbered of the Thoughtful Banter podcast. I'm your host, Matthew, with my co-host, Hussein.
Yes, sir.
And today we are graded by the amazing Sayyid Sulayman. Thank you so much for joining us.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for inviting me on.
Walaikum salam. Walaikum salam. Yeah, we've actually, funny enough, like Hussein and I have had the idea of like getting Sayyid Sulayman on for like a super long time. Like even 2 years ago, when we were planning the podcast.
It's probably better we waited, but
yeah. Of course. But like even like so when like 2 years ago when we started this journey, you know, we were just thinking about this concept of like Muslim American or American Muslim, and like thinking of basically unwrapping the concept of like how to be Muslim in the West. And say his name will always come up with conversation. You're actually you're the, I guess, most referenced anonymous quote Hussein goes to. Like every other episode.
Anonymity is good because that gives plausible deniability.
There we go.
And it allows the idea to stand on its own merits, which is also important.
Yeah. I'm like, I heard a scholar say one time.
Many times, yeah.
It's probably just as well, because anything of insight that I say is probably from somebody else anyway. It's probably It's probably not from me.
That's how it works, right?
Exactly.
Of course, yeah. So we have like so many questions we can ask you, but one that's specifically on our minds today that I think you can speak to is one of culture and religion. We're kind of, we Hussein and I have actually both had debates about this, right? Like, is it more beneficial for a society to have an Islamic culture, and what are the pros and cons of that, versus a society that has a more agnostic or irreligious culture, but people within the society just practice Islam? What are your thoughts?
Hold on, before you get to your answer, sorry. Just to give you a little bit more background, the way this came up is that Mahdi is teaching at a Sunday school, and basically something that he noticed, him and the other teachers there, is that a lot of the younger, or I guess of age, baligh women were not wearing hijab. And it was just very apparent, especially relative to even our generation growing up. And so this whole discussion of how do we create this kind of American culture, because Mahdi's argument is, or his idea is, that because their parents or maybe their grandparents migrated from a country where the culture was Islamic, but they didn't have a lot of knowledge of actually what Islam says. Once they come here and that culture doesn't fit anymore, they kind of just leave everything. So specifically on that point, I guess, is what I want to get your thoughts on.
So let's start from there. That's a good starting point. I mean, when you live in an Islamic society, then you're not always consciously choosing something because of Islam, which doesn't mean that your choices are not Islamic, but they might be for a number of reasons. So in a traditional Islamic society, there might be many people who practice very good hijab, but they might not pray. And it might be partially their own personal sense of modesty as a human being, not specifically in obedience to God or seeking to please God, but just their sense of propriety. Just like in America, we have a certain sense of personal distance, which is different from other cultures.
Very
Americans tend to have hypersensitivity towards body odor. You might have other cultures where human body odor is not as big a deal. They might be just as hygienic and clean, but they have different sensitivities. So now, cleanliness is part of Islam, but a person might want to groom themselves or wear clean clothes or wear a fragrance or a deodorant, not out of a religious sense. They might do it out of a sense of what fits in their culture or what fits their personality. So what often happens when a person comes from that kind of traditional society and they come to another society where the expectations are different, if they haven't consciously thought about why I'm doing it, then they might shift their practice without necessarily compromising their sense of religiosity, because it was never conscious. If you've grown up in a society where everything that you eat is going to automatically be halal, you may not be irreligious, but you've never had to actually wonder,
Check.
where is this meat from? And is it dhabiha? Is it permissible for me to eat or not? What often ends up happening, though, is that after a while, people will re-examine the difference in practice that they see among different members of their community or family or society, re-examine what it is that Islam wants. And so you might see a generation that comes, say, immigrates to a new society that is traditional for tradition's sake. Then their children might not be as practicing because of a lack of conscious identification with Islamic teaching. And then in another generation, you might actually see a resurgence of, say, praying or hijab or fasting or other Islamic practice because people are now learning to do those things for the sake of Islam. So there is a risk that in that intervening 1 or 2 generations, you might lose a great deal. But it is also part of the natural process of the mixing of different cultures. And intrinsically, it's not something to be afraid of. What we want to do is we want to make sure that we minimize the losses when different cultures mix in that way or collide. We don't want people to associate traditional practices that were influenced by an Islamic value system just with culture. And we also don't want people to be looking for a purely Islamic practice devoid of culture. And I think that comes to perhaps, Mahdi, what you were asking earlier, that there is no purely Islamic practice that doesn't fit within a culture. So if we want to see the relationship, some people see it as in conflict, but if we want to see it as a relationship, it's a dynamic relationship where Islam attaches to any particular culture and it shifts it in certain directions. So there is no one type of dress that is Islamic. Arab dress is not Islamic as opposed to South Asian or East Asian or Sub-Saharan Africa or Northern Europe. Any of those cultures can have an Islamic dress, but if there are some where, say, the dress is tight and shows the form of the body, for men or for women, then Islam will influence that culture to have a more modest, a more loose-fitting dress, or a form of dress that allows a person to pray. So, for example, a hat that does not allow a person to go into prostration might be shifted to a form of head covering that allows a person to do sujood.
A beanie.
That you can roll
a beanie,
up.
Exactly. Or shirts might be longer because when you go into ruku, or when you bow down, or when you go into prostration, if you're wearing a t-shirt or a short shirt for men or for women, then it won't be modest. So we shouldn't think of the relationship of Islam as with culture as a culture being Islamic or un-Islamic, but rather it's a dynamic relationship. Any culture, even one where people have been Muslims for generations or for centuries, will have elements that Islam will critique and will shift dynamically, gradually in a certain direction. And that's a healthy way for us to see how Islam and culture relate. So I don't know if that addresses both of your questions or just one of them. If not, let me know.
I think it did, and there were a lot of great points in that. I think especially because my question to Mahdi when he was talking to me about this was kind of, well, what distinguishes the people that come here and don't do that versus the people who do come here and then forget their Islam, or their kids forget their Islam? Like, what is the distinguishing factor? And I think you touched on it as far as when they become conscious of it, what do they do? Second question, I guess, is it seems that we kind of have two extremes. It's people who migrate here, their children migrate here, and either they seclude themselves in like their own cultural bubbles, so they basically try to recreate what they had back home, or, you know, this is what we're talking about, they kind of go off of the deep end, which is just not practicing at all, because I can't even, the culture that I had there doesn't even fit, so I'm just not going to worry about it. I guess my question is about the people in the middle, because you do have people who are religious, conscious about the religiosity, won't eat, like very worried about where their meat comes from, for example, will pray. But simultaneously, they also kind of very strongly believe in some core American values that might not exactly jive with the essence of Islam, if you want to call it that. I guess my question is, because I think I see a lot more of those types, so maybe their priorities are misaligned.
That's probably true. You know, sometimes it's common for Americans to assume certain assumptions, certain values are universal when they're not. So just, you know, my own real experience in a different culture for the first time was when I lived in Iran. And I went to Iran, you know, end of my teenage years. And, you know, there are certain ways of interacting or talking about people that it's very easy to say, oh, that is chauvinistic or racist, or, you know, that seems to be rude, or that seems to be dishonest. And at least for me, it took a while for me to realize that, wait a minute, the vantage point from which I find something offensive is not as universal as I think it is. It's a particular American experience. So Americans, for example, we have a history in this country. We have an association with the word slavery.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? That doesn't have to be the case in other societies. You know, we have an assumption, for example, about who can speak about certain issues. So, you know, if I were just to start pontificating about issues facing black women, even if everything I said was true, it would not play well.
No. Canceled. Say it to them on cancel.
Yeah, I could, and anyone could cancel themselves very easily. But that is part of a certain history and discourse, and we tend to assume you know, that is universal. Another one that now is starting to get some attention is cultural appropriation. You know, it's never been something that I've heard from, say, an Indian, that why are people wearing our clothes? But in America, when you dress up in an exotic manner, it's often perceived very differently. And I'm not saying it's not offensive. Sometimes it is offensive, you know, but it's perceived differently.
Yeah.
And we can't apply that. So the bottom line is that we are often applying certain values without realizing that they're not universal. And that's the key first step, is to recognize that the way that Americans tend to talk and interact and see themselves and see others is not universal. It's not a natural progression of history. And history has not come to an end, you know, with Western liberal society or politics. And then you can start to critique. And you can enter into that dynamic that we were talking about earlier, which is to say, is this an Islamic approach? So, for example, when we talk about an ideal family, what should the role of a husband be? What should the role of a wife be? That ideal is going to look very different in America than it would, say, in a rural traditional society in a land that has been Muslim for generations. But the directions that role will take as a husband, as a wife, as a parent, as a spouse, as a sibling, whatever role you're talking about within a family, the directions that will take, both in America and in that very different society, will both be informed by the priorities given to us by Islam, which are not, for example, material affluence and profit, right? Or acquiring political power, or whatever values might come from a different religion or a different belief system. And that's where we can see the value. The key step, I think, that we often miss is to recognize that I need to critique my assumptions as an American and recognize that this is the product of a particular history, and we are not a city on top of a hill. We are not God's gift to humanity. And we are a civilization and a society and a culture like any other, with its strengths and its weaknesses. And we need to try to evaluate our unspoken assumptions on the basis of our ideals. Not to demonize them either, because that's another extreme, but to be able to look humbly and critically. Once people can do that, then they enter into a process of reforming not just how we act and how we eat and how we dress, but even how we conceive of ourselves and of our role within society in a direction that is informed by Islam.
Sorry, I just have one last thing, and then you can go. I promise. I promise. Where do you think, I guess, that kind of universal thinking, especially, it seems to me like it's majority a Western thing, especially about, like, I guess, the specific morals or attitudes that we have and how they're, even if we don't say them, we inherently think that they're like superior, or implicitly think that they're inherently superior, rather. Where do you think that comes from? And I think a good example of this, a simple, silly example, but like you mentioned, cultural appropriation. It was always interesting to me when I heard these discussions about cultural appropriation. And then I see like the online reactions of the people that culture is being appropriated. And they're like, oh, wow, there's a foreigner who really loves our dress or really loves our food. So it's very interesting. And I think that was a good example. Where do you think that comes from?
That triumphalism?
Yeah.
I think that, historically, it's probably a discussion that requires deeper study, and those who have engaged in that study would be able to give a much more insightful answer. But morally speaking, I think that there is a difficulty in conceiving of what an Islamic value system represents. So for many people, when they're in the West, when they want to be a good Muslim, they want to have a Muslim identity. And the identity is still about the self. And so I want to dress or talk or act or, disown my own family because they're not religious enough and find a group of friends who are like true believers. And I want to be an arif or a Sufi or a spiritual person, and I want to have experiences. And I know people, for example, who don't come to the masjid because they can create a better ambiance for worship at home. So now you're trying to be religious, but all of those things are about me. And, if there is an uncle in the community or an aunt in the community who is a little bit rough around the edges and
hard
scolds
to be
me
around a little bit.
I lose my
spiritual vibes.
Yeah, I'm like I can't feel it anymore. Well, then what I was feeling was maybe self-serving and not a true spiritual goal. So the challenge, this is not a historical answer to your question where that triumphalism comes from through, the history of mercantilism or imperialism or colonialism or post-colonialism. It's a moral explanation or an effort to explain it morally. That when I am individualistic, then I've never gotten past my ego. Even if I want to be religious, then my religion will be about my identity and about my ego. Whereas in Islam, the very word Muslim implies that our religion is about an affiliation, about an orientation
towards something or
towards God. So it is moving from the self. My sight, my goal is to serve, to be an abd, to be a devotee, a worshipper of God. That, I think, is what can get rid of that triumphalism that you're talking about. Appropriation, to take that example, cultural appropriation. It comes from a sense that, well, to see something as exotic, to try it on kind of as a costume, it feels demeaning to me or within my cultural context. But it's not really, necessarily how
other people kind of perceive
how other people will perceive it. Nor is it necessarily how maybe other people might perceive it that way because of the way that I appropriate or I adopt their practices. But it's not necessary within that adoption.
Yeah.
So, for example, it might actually be the case that when I, from that culture, wear that, fancy headgear, it is a little bit offensive. But when somebody else goes for Umrah or for Ziyarah and they adopt or appropriate that same culture because they're not doing it with that same expectation or from that same background, it wouldn't be offensive at all. So I think the moral cause of that triumphalism is an inability to move past a focus on the self. So even in secular culture, it's not that they're trying to be Islamic, but they're trying to be moral.
Yeah.
They're trying to be fair. But even that morality, or for Muslims, even their religiosity is about the self and perceiving things as we perceive them. So sometimes, for example, you have people who care about animal rights, or say they're environmentalists or vegans. That's another,
Yeah, don't get me started.
Extreme example. But it's based on humanizing something that is not human. And that's not moral or just. That's supremely arrogant. Right?
They're so mad right now.
To think that my cat wants chemotherapy.
Yeah.
So I'm spending thousands of dollars, to extend the life of my cat because I love it, when, probably that cat just wanted to die like 5 years ago when its natural lifespan would have come to an end.
Just quick. Yeah.
I'm not only saying that from a religious perspective. From a religious perspective, we have a number of priorities. But even from simply a sense of the natural order of things without looking at it as coming from God. It's difficult for a Muslim to do because we believe that nature is a manifestation of God's wisdom and power. But to treat a cat for chemotherapy with chemotherapy for its cancer or whatever other ailment it has is just as absurd on one level as to try to make a cat a vegetarian.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Not because God created it in a certain way, but because a cat is a carnivore. That's its nature. and it wasn't created to go through that grueling medical procedure. So I don't think it's only a Muslim critique, but certainly as a Muslim, we do have a different perspective that we have. So all of this boils down to that same idea that when we want to see things through our own lens, then not only do we view other cultures and adoption of the dress or the food or the practices of another culture through our own experiences, values, priorities, history, but it extends even farther than that to the animal kingdom, to nature itself. And I think that bumbling around in that way, we do a great deal of damage because you are othering and making exotic something that throughout human history cultures have interacted and imitated and adopted and enriched themselves through that means.
As a result of it, yeah.
So when you arrest that process, you make it difficult, then you're doing damage to culture, just like you're doing damage to nature by trying to impose
vegetarianism on your cat.
Well, vegetarianism or a human-centered view where it doesn't belong.
Have a vegan cat.
Going back to
I hope you don't have a vegan cat. That's abuse.
That's abuse. That's absurd.
Even a vegan human, I think, is
Yeah.
self-abuse.
Funny story. I actually tried being vegan for 30 days. Wasn't worth it.
Well, you did the vegetarian thing for 30 days, so that you actually successfully did that.
No, I also did vegan for 30 days.
No, but I mean, like, you completed.
I completed vegan too.
You did? I don't
Yeah,
remember
it was just
that.
terrible. It was grueling.
Difficult, or did you notice physical or other effects?
You know,
I mean, beyond missing foods that you really like.
So here's the thing. I actually got better at cooking because of it, and I think I was able to satisfy I was able to convince myself my palate was satisfied. Like, I don't need beef. I'm eating quinoa and salt and like some, nutritional yeast on it. You know what I'm saying? Some olive oil. But one thing I did notice was, even though I was eating like at a calorie deficit, I was eating the same calories I was before, I felt a lot weaker. And I gained body fat during that time. I didn't change up like my weightlifting routine. I just felt like weaker, more sluggish. I was like, this isn't it.
For me, the bigger problem is the imposition. I mean, it's one thing for a person to say, hey, I don't like beef anyway, or I'm allergic to meat. Apparently now there's a tick that
Interesting.
one of the it's apparently a new thing that if you get a certain kind of tick bite, then it makes you allergic to meat. And so, I mean, it's one thing for a person to say, I don't like, or I don't feel a need, or maybe, I have a physical reaction to eating meat. But the problem really is in the imputation to morality, the imputation of a moral superiority, because, there are subsistence societies where if you take away their chickens, or you take away their goats, or you take away their domesticated animals, they might not be able to maintain their nutrition or their independence. And so it's a very unhealthy way of looking maybe at personal nutrition. I don't know. I'm not qualified to really make that determination. But certainly of looking at what is a recommendation for people, in their diet. And there's certain regions of the world where, because of the topography or the temperatures, agriculture is not feasible. And so a vegetarian, much less a vegan diet, would be impossible to to even maintain.
It also seems quite arbitrary because, for instance, like if it's a moral argument and it's a matter of, okay, don't hurt animals. It's like, okay, but you're not hurting a cow by milking it. Like, that's just milking a cow. It's like, so, and it's funny, right? Because like, and this isn't across the board true, of course, but from what I've witnessed, people who are vegans, I haven't seen a trend that they are usually Christians or Muslims. In fact, if I said there was a trend, I would say that the trend was mostly like they didn't have any one specific religious group. They're people who are considered themselves just spiritual, you know. But it's like, how is this better than, like, how are you hurting the cow by drinking its milk? And also, if you look at like the food, like the plant-based meat, how much agriculture, like how many animals are just killed because of the processing of the meat? Like, they have to make these huge farms where they just grow like one thing, and to do that, they have to burn all the existing forests. So all the mice, all the birds, all the snakes that live there to make the patty, to make you feel morally superior, where you're just like, the Beyond Meat patty sure tastes good.
There are secular arguments against veganism in particular, and also against vegetarianism. I don't know how much we should focus on that. It's one thing for us to say that, you know, as you say, you're killing animals either way, or you're damaging, fragile ecosystems either way. If you're not directly slaughtering, say, a cow, then your agriculture might result in the deaths of many insects, many animals, and then the other animals that would have fed on the insects that would have lived if you hadn't cultivated that land, and if there were trees and forests and so on. So there is an argument that's sometimes made, not from a religious perspective, about whether vegetarianism or veganism is actually hypocritical or contradicts its own assumptions.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's really where our focus should be. As long as a person is not imputing a moral superiority to that choice, if there isn't God, then for a human being to choose to be a vegetarian or to choose to be exclusively a meat eater would be no different than any other animal to be an herbivore or a carnivore or an omnivore. If there is no God and no lawgiver, and no one to say what is right or what is wrong, I don't judge a lion for being a carnivore. In fact, if I said that, we're going to eliminate all of the apex predators from an ecosystem because they kill animals, what's going to happen to all of the other animals in that ecosystem? Once it's destroyed, they're all, you'll have an overpopulation.
Complete collapse.
You have a collapse. So if there's no lawgiver, if there's no God, then there's no moral superiority for any choice.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's no purpose. And if there is a lawgiver or a creator, then the only moral choice is the one that is legislated and revealed by that lawgiver. So it's insightful sometimes to see some of the absurdities of these moral systems that people come up with, these religions that they come up with without calling them a religion.
Yeah,
absolutely.
But it shouldn't.
Religions.
They're religions.
They are religions because, like, literally, it's like you are bad. And I remember I went through when I went through my vegan phase. It was because I was just trying it out. I was like, what's the deal with this? I never thought it was immoral. Alhamdulillah. Like, I never went that deep down the rabbit hole. But I was like, yeah, maybe it's healthier because their means is like they just want to convert you by any means. So they'll try the health route. They'll try like the emotional
health,
route.
the environmental, the justice,
exactly.
And they have like all like of these false comparisons. Like, would you go and buy human milk from a store? And I heard like a very funny comedian was saying like, vegans always talk about You know, would you do that, for instance? Would you go from a store and say, I'm buying human milk? It's like, no. Do cows fly planes? Like, there's a lot of things I do that a cow doesn't do. But I want to go.
But we shouldn't obscure from the fact that that's all fair and true. But the key is that is there a right and wrong in society? And regardless of how absurd it is or isn't, it's really about whether you believe that there is a revealed source, a divine source for what is right or what is wrong. If there is, then if the Prophet did it, if the Imams did it, if God legislated it or sanctioned it, then I don't really need to, because it's arrogant for a human being to defend meat eating or to oppose meat eating on the basis of what we understand. Like, what is our scientific knowledge? What is our health knowledge? And forget the health effects and the physical effects. How can I even begin to gauge what are the spiritual effects of different diets and different eating times? You know, fasting, for example. I can't quantify with any reliability whether avoiding food and drink during the day makes me a better person. I might be able to quantify some physical benefits.
Yeah.
But that's not only the spiritual benefits. The Quran says, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, perhaps you may become pious. You can't quantify it. So the whole process is arrogant.
I like it.
Not supporting veganism or vegetarianism, even opposing it.
Yeah.
As if we're going to, just do one more study and then we'll get the conclusive answer. In the end, if you believe in God, then you follow God's guidance. And humility is a key part of, in fact, the key ingredient to faith. We do the study, we experience the benefits maybe of limiting our meat consumption or whatever it is, and if there are studies that show that a vegetarian diet has certain benefits or a vegan diet has certain benefits, we're not going to close our eyes or try to explain them away because we're in denial of reality either. But in the end, our decisions are guided by a different metric, a different logic.
I think you were also talking about that earlier this summer as well. Kind of when we get into these debates about
what's best
or abortion debates, for example, we can kind of sidestep the silly. We don't have to hold so firm to, I guess, maybe man-found reasoning, and then can instead kind of sidestep the issue by actually looking towards the person that we're supposed to be orienting ourselves, the God that we're supposed to be orienting ourselves.
Well, you can't sidestep it entirely because, religious practice can only grow and be enriched if it's reasonable. So we can't just say, well, God said.
Yeah.
But yes, we can sidestep having to decide entirely by justifying.
Yeah, exactly.
What is wrong with this lifestyle that God said is wrong. It's not on us to prove it.
Yeah, you no longer have to prove the personhood of a 7-day-old fetus, for example. Right?
We should try to contemplate and try to understand God's wisdom. We should study. We should be humble. But in the end, we also recognize the limits of our intellectual processes. And therefore, we have another factor in our decision-making. I think, Mahdi, I cut you off earlier. I don't know if you remember what you were going to say.
I was actually curious about bringing it back to the Sunday school question I had, because you answer the question that Hussein raised, but what I'm curious to know is I feel just so pessimistic. I'm like, how are we going to survive? How is Islam? Like, I'm in this, I'm teaching there. And I'm like, when I was these 8-year-olds age, when I was 8 at Sunday school, I remember all the little girls there who didn't even need to wear hijab wearing hijab because they wanted to be like their mothers.
That's not necessarily something to be pessimistic about.
Well, it's that I saw that And I'm like, now I'm older. And the parents taking their kids to Sunday school aren't wearing hijab. And hijab is just one thing. I'm not using this one site to say, oh, the religion's done. But I'm just thinking like, okay, what's it going to look like in 100 years?
Well, that takes us back to the beginning. And this is one of the insidious things about our culture here in America in particular, is that we sometimes assume that certain things are like the unrolling and the inevitable end of history. And a lot of people, like, they give themselves up to a certain liberal agenda or a certain, I don't mean that in a political sense, but in a cultural and in a moral sense, that, you know, certain, let's say with regard to gender or with regard to abortion or with regard to hijab, they think that, all right, it's all unraveling and at some point it's going to unravel completely. And, you know, we're putting up a good fight, but we're on the losing side. And that itself makes you feel less willpower and courage in putting up a fight when you think that eventually the battle is going to be lost. And that takes us back to the very first start of this discussion, which is there is a natural process.
Yeah. And you mentioned like the generation, you might have one generation that's absolutely, you know, done with Islam, left it behind, and the generation that follows kind of.
Yeah, so with abortion, we see that. You know, there are people maybe in the generation that experienced, you know, a rise in unsafe abortions and pregnancies and all the attendant risks. You know, potentially a larger number of people were in favor of free access to abortion than a generation that grew up with an ultrasound.
Yeah.
And with, you know, like a visual reality in front of you that you can't quite call it a clump of cells. You know, maybe you don't think it's a person.
But it's something.
But it's something. It's not just
nothing.
It's not a tumor, you know. And the same thing, you know, about other things. If you go to urban environments and universities, sometimes you see that the percentage of people wearing hijab in some cities in the Muslim world has gone up, say since the 60s or the 70s. And it might go down again. My point is that nothing in history is inevitable. We're not on the losing side. You would rather be in a society where 20% of people wear hijab, but the percentage of practice is going up 3% a year, than in a society where 60% or 70% of people wear hijab, but the number of people practicing it is going down 3% a year. Environments and universities, sometimes you see that the percentage of people wearing hijab in some cities in the Muslim world has gone up, say since the 60s or the 70s. And it might go down again. My point is that nothing in history is inevitable. We're not on the losing side. You would rather be in a society where 20% of people wear hijab, but the percentage of practice is going up 3% a year, than in a society where 60% or 70% of people wear hijab, but the number of people practicing it is going down 3% a year.
Yeah.
So the dynamic is more important than the current,
like what you're
static,
seeing,
you know, data point. You want to look at the trajectory. And in that Sunday school class, you know, this might be a subset of the community, or it might just be a low point in the general life of our community. It might be a cause of concern and maybe urgency, but it doesn't need to be a cause of pessimism. Because remember, pessimism is about the future, not about the present or about the past. And the future is not inevitable. So urgency, yes. If I see a bad state in society, then I should recognize the depth of the problems that we are facing, whether it be prayer or drugs or hijab or any other issue that we're facing. But it shouldn't make me pessimistic, because that doesn't mean that, well, this agenda is going to, you know,
fall apart.
The agenda that I'm opposing is going to spread everywhere. It's not inevitable.
Yeah.
We should always be optimistic, because in the end, God has a plan for everything.
If you want to support the podcast, you can go to patreon.com/thoughtful banter. There you can get early access to our content and read poorly put together articles by myself and decently well put together articles by Hussein, because he has something worth reading. And you're just reading schizophrenia when I write, but I'm using ChatGPT to clean it up. So you can support us there, and maybe get a couple of free things. Get a couple of things there, and make yourself feel like, oh, it's not for, I'm giving my money to them, I'm getting something back. You're not getting much back, but we appreciate the support. Thank you.
So there's kind of two directions I can take the conversation. One is probably a lot longer than the other. And if you have anything to ask or add in here, you can feel free to jump in. But there's one, which is, and I'm going to just throw them up to you and you can decide. One is kind of going back to what you were talking about, the ego and the self, and looking at things through the lens of the ego and through the lens of the self. And I guess my question there is like, because it seems in my mind, it seems like the subject is always a part of every kind of interpretation, every kind of experience of something that happens. And so how do we remove, I guess, what is the Islamic ideal of how we should conceptualize ourselves? I guess that's one question. And I know you kind of touched on that a little bit as far as...
The goal is not to remove ourselves.
That's a crazy question, bro.
It sounds like you have an insightful answer.
No, I don't. I'm
shape in your
no, I'm
in
just
your
empty.
mind.
It's an empty void in here, please.
But I mean, the goal is always a direction.
Mm.
So you want to orient yourself towards God so completely that God takes you by the hand. I don't want to progress spiritually on my own terms. That's why a lot of people in the West, we have a hard time understanding the idea of seeking in a wasila, a means of approach to God, or the value of intercession, or the value of praying for other people who are deceased. They're dead. They've already done their actions. And that's because we always think of things on our own terms. But if we reorient ourselves to see that we are created by God, even our life is a trust given to us by God. I'm not ever trying to eliminate myself from the equation. I'm just trying to orient myself towards God. And at some point, God will take me by the hand, and he might begin to efface my ego.
Oh,
I cannot do that. Have you ever tried to concentrate in prayer? And you're trying to concentrate so much that your concentration becomes a distraction,
Yeah.
right? So concentration, sincerity, effacing the self, it's not something that you do on your own terms. You orient yourself properly. You try to develop sincerity in your intention, and then it's God who is going to complete that sincerity, who's going to guide your steps. وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. Those who strive in our way, we guide them to the paths that lead to God.
Yeah, the easy paths.
So, but that it's not that I'm going to remove myself, because that is a vicious cycle. I orient myself, and then God removes me from the equation by degrees. By his blessing.
Okay.
Wow. Wow.
That was actually shorter than I thought it was going to be too. So.
No, to me, it's refreshing because, and I'm going to use probably all of the wrong words here, so feel free to correct me. But I feel like in the way our Islam many times we manifest it, just generally as Muslims, it comes from or the way it's manifested is from a very OCD place. It's a very tick for tat. It's
partially because we have a inferiority complex. Sometimes we have an insecurity. But if you're on God's team, not God is on my team, because it's not my team. If I'm on God's team is going to win. I might die. And that's okay.
Yeah.
It's not my victory that I need to, in American fiction often, you don't kill the hero early in the story, because then the whole story is about the hero. Even works of fiction where they kill the hero, it's like for shock value.
Yeah.
You thought he was going to survive or she was going to survive. But it's because it's about the person. It's not my team. I'm on God's team. God's team is always going to win.
Hmm.
So what's the insecurity? What's the inferiority complex? What is there? You're completely at ease.
It's very peaceful. It feels like
it's tranquil.
It gives
it's not
it tranquility.
It's not complacent because you have a responsibility given to you by God. But in the end, it's God's religion. It's not my religion. And that's a message that God gives the prophet in the Quran as well. That if God, you don't lose yourself if people don't accept your religion. If God wanted, He could have made it, unavoidable. But God didn't make it unavoidable. He gave people the choice.
SubhanAllah.
Is that the mic drop moment where we conclude for what is it, episode 2?
Yeah. We definitely are going to need a part 2 to this. But anyway, we didn't even get to like the other parts of what we wanted to
By the way, none of these questions were given in advance, so this was completely a free-flowing conversation.
Extemporaneous, off the dome.
Yeah, if any thoughts were undeveloped, then that's because it was a free-flowing conversation. There's a benefit to that, I think.
Yeah.
Once again, thank you for the invitation. Mahdi, I think you sold yourself short by saying that your writings are underdeveloped. I'm sure both of you have a lot of insights to share. When we think of Islam as not a static data point, but as a dynamic relationship, even if you don't have great answers, if you have thoughtful questions, then that is sometimes more valuable than a thoughtful answer. Because a thoughtful answer might make me complacent, but a thoughtful question will keep me seeking and journeying and humble. So don't sell yourself short. Always try to ask good questions. And don't worry if you don't get perfect answers, because life is the journey for better answers, for more profound answers. Sometimes an answer that clicks might not be as deep and therefore as useful as one that makes us think. So I hope this conversation has helped us all think, and inshallah it will be of some benefit to everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Alaikum assalam.